Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Today I've got a return guest. I've got Phil Bourjaily, the Ducks Unlimited magazine shotgunning columnist, joining me once again. Phil, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
You know, Phil and I have gone back and forth and discussed offline and even on the DU podcast, just some different things that we can talk about. And I think today's show, we're really going to get into what we had discussed earlier on the podcast where Phil kind of made a transition into a 20 gauge. And for those of you who've listened to our past shows, will know that Phil is a big fan of the 12 gauge, also a big fan of the 10 gauge for geese, but he did a little kind of dabbling in the 20 gauge realm this season. So Phil, how did that work out for you as far as, your goose season and duck season up there in Iowa?
It worked pretty well. I would say right out front, the sample size was extremely small this year. My duck season was not good. Goose season was pretty good, but, I shot a couple different guns. I shot one of those CZ over-unders, those all-terrain guns, and, one of those M2, Rob Roberts M2 waterfowl performance shotguns. Mostly I shot bismuth shot. I shot bismuth 3s, which to me is a good all around size for, if you don't know if there's going to be ducks or geese in the decoys. And I tend to like bigger shot anyway, and that's about as big as bismuth shot gets. And it worked very well. Now I'm, because I don't hunt with retrievers, I'm a very conservative shot. So pretty much everything I shot was in the decoys, but I didn't have any trouble killing birds with it. And it was enjoyable. That said, when it got to the end of goose season, I chickened out, and I had one not very good hunt with the 20 gauge with geese. I didn't lose any birds, but nothing got away from me, but it wasn't pretty. And, so then I put that up and I got my 12 gauge out.
When you say it wasn't pretty, as far as
I was chasing birds around and, that one of those kind of hunts, where things did not hit the ground as, dead as they should be.
Yeah, that happens. And I do know that, one thing that I've kind of learned hunting with the 20 gauge off and on is, we, especially like you're typically probably hunting in a layout blind. Mm-hmm. Those smaller little compact guns do provide a little bit of benefit there, when you're in the layout blinds. Did you notice any of that?
They're fun to carry and fun to shoot. I think I was talking to a friend of mine who was a very serious waterfowler and sporting clays shooter, and we were kind of agreeing that what you give up with the 20 gauge is almost not as much the ballistics as if you're taking longer shots. A bigger, heavier gun is just easier to shoot. If you wanted to, a gun for just pointing and shooting over decoys, the 20 gauge is great. If you're pass shooting, if you're backing people up, whatever, you need a gun that's got the heft and the discipline to swing on those longer shots. I think that's when a 12 gauge really is a better gun.
And you mentioned, before we came on, you mentioned that your duck and goose seasons were not exactly ideal, but you did finish on a pretty strong note. Do you want to share that story? Because I know that's pretty cool.
I did. Everybody's season should end the way mine did. I highly recommend it. We had a lot of snow this year at the end of December, and our goose season ran in mid-January. So I was hauling decoys and blinds on a sled through some pretty deep snow. So it was a chore, and I hunted the last 2 days of the season. The first day I had to haul my stuff about a half mile to get up to this hilltop where I was able to shoot my birds, but there weren't a lot, and I could see from where I was where the birds were going. The X field was about 3/4 of a mile away. And so I got in there the next day, and there was sign everywhere. There's tracks and holes in the snow where the geese had been digging the corn up, and there were no geese. They just, I don't know, they went somewhere else that day. I couldn't believe it. It was a really goosey day. It's the kind of day you think about in the off season. It was cold, but not too cold. It was windy. It was spitting sleet. It was gray. It was, what I think of as just a perfect goose hunting day. And it had everything but geese. I sat there in the blind for a few hours and kind of resigning myself to ending the season by just staring at empty skies, which is okay because you have to go on the last day regardless, no matter what happens. That's a very important to me to see the season out. And, I just finished my snack, and I guess geese get hungry the same time I do, because I looked up and here came a flock. It was the only bunch of the day. And, they were down low over the corn stubble. And the clouds behind me even broke up a little bit, so they were lit up when they came in, which was great. And about 30 yards from the blind, they started to backpedal, and I sat up and I shot two, and there was another one, and I thought, do I want to be done? But yes, I do. And I shot that one, and that's the one that was banded. So it was pretty spectacular. And it was about as big a thrill to me as those three birds in the band. It was like shooting a turkey. It was that exciting for me to go up and pick those birds up.
Yeah, I hope could only imagine that everyone could finish their season like that.
Yeah, it's the best. I've been giddy ever since. It's just thinking back about it. I don't mind that it's not hunting season anymore. I can just think about that.
That's the one that you'll be sitting there in July and thinking, oh man, that's enough to get you through the off season. That's pretty spectacular.
Yeah, well, thank you. I would say I highly recommend it to everyone.
Where was the bird banded?
In town, locally.
Okay, it's local.
Yeah, no, it was. The bands we shoot here, almost everyone is banded right here locally. I've got one from Rochester, Minnesota, and everything else is local. And almost all of them are those too young to fly when banded, which always makes me feel bad. But doesn't stop me from going again.
That's fantastic. That is the perfect way to end the season.
It was wonderful.
The main reason why I got you on here to talk is just in the recent issue of the magazine that just came out. You wrote a column, and it was called "The Physics of Shotgunning," and it really kind of stuck with me because the way that you broke down the real physics of shotgunning, not necessarily, it is ballistics, it is what it is, but it's not necessarily in that term. You didn't phrase it that way, and phrase it much more so that a layman can understand exactly what you're talking about in as far as velocity and air resistance, recoil. And I'd like to just kind of walk through that and maybe put that into some real life situations that you can kind of explain. But first, kind of explain where this idea came from. This is something, it's a little bit outside the box here, and it's just a cool column that I hope people have really, really enjoyed. But where did the idea come from?
I'd like to take credit for it, but actually it was DU editor Matt Young. Now, Matt may very well have been thinking of Bob Brister's Shotgunning the Art and Science, which I hope people still read that book, because that is absolutely the best book written. Very accessible, but it lays out a lot of these ideas about what is actually going on inside a shotgun and in the air once pellets, meet air resistance and travel toward the target. That's a book that's really helped me understand a lot more about shotguns and shotgun shells. It dates 1976. That was the very earliest days of steel shot. There wasn't a nationwide mandate yet, but there was steel. And so he does talk about that. But, so a lot of the stuff about, at least from a waterfowling perspective, a lot of the stuff about lead shot is outdated, but, it's still a fascinating read. Absolutely. And every shotgunner should have that book and read it. My copy is about worn out. Had it forever. And I think that's probably, I'm going to guess that's what Matt was thinking of when he signed this column. Because it's really one of the most important books about shotgun shooting ever written.
Yeah. Our audience should take note of that and, be sure to, get a copy of that. And, it really does kind of explain the approach that you took here. And the first thing that you really do here is you quote Einstein in the piece, obviously with physics, and it makes a really great initial introduction, and it's nothing happens until something moves. Can you kind of play on that as how you really chose, that quote from Einstein to introduce this column?
Shot moving down the barrel is, that's where it all begins for us. You pull the trigger and there's chemical reactions and heat energy and all of these things that lead to gases expanding and a shot load being pushed down the barrel. And that's when everything starts. Up to then, it's all just potential energy. It's just sitting there in the gun. Just
waiting on your trigger finger, right?
Right. Exactly.
And in the first part of the column, you discuss recoil.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about that kind of many times, really, how to balance recoil, either, to get the recoil limited, how important recoil is, especially even for a second shot. But in the column, you start right out with a 3.5-inch shell shooting from a light shotgun. Kind of explain this whole reaction and this process that, all of recoil is generated here, and how people can understand recoil and control it to a sense, I guess I should say.
Recoil and kick are two different things. Recoil is math. Recoil is gun weight, it's velocity, and it's the weight of the ejecta, the payload, which is the shot, the wad, and the powder. And there's a formula, which is, and that's all that recoil. That's an absolute number. The best way to reduce recoil, if you want to reduce recoil, you can increase gun weight, but the more efficient way to do it is to decrease velocity or decrease payload, because those, when you increase or decrease them, that's an exponential, whereas the weight is not. So it really makes that extra 1/8 of an ounce of shot, or that extra couple hundred feet per second of velocity. That's what really increases recoil. Now, the other half of recoil, I say, is not so much physics, it's more ergonomics, I guess, is felt recoil. And that, the best explanation and I'm going to steal this one from my friend Bruce Buck. He said, you want to understand felt recoil, shoot a gun from your shoulder, then put it on your forehead and pull the trigger again. Which one kicks harder? And that's felt recoil. Obviously, if you've got the gun on your shoulder, you're going to feel a certain amount of recoil. If you put the gun up against your forehead and pull the trigger, like I'm sure you've seen people do on YouTube probably, that kicks a lot harder. And that is felt recoil. And that is a function of recoil pads. It's a function of a gas operated gun to an extent. This extension function of gun fit, how much clothing you're wearing, all those things, how you hold the gun. That all is felt recoil, which is kind of outside the realm of physics. The physics part of it is purely the gun weight, the payload velocity, and the payload weight.
So if people are looking to reduce that recoil, the main recommendation there is gun weight and velocity, as far as just a little bit less powder or shot in the shell. So you're decreasing your feet per second, or increasing one way or the other. You can always increase to if you're comfortable with the actual recoil of the gun. But kind of explain that, and I think that's a good way to explain the felt recoil, as far as moving the gun to a different position. But I think a good example of that for me immediately just kind of comes into my head is when you don't get the gun into your shoulder correctly, or maybe a little bit low, that felt recoil changes. Like, oh man, that one actually hurt. I'm not used to getting that recoil and having, noticing it. But if you don't get that gun positioned properly, that's another good example for people to use as far as felt recoil, and not necessarily the mathematical equation that you're referring to in this. So
I usually don't notice a shell kicking unless I've made a bad shot, or a shot that I wasn't really focused on. If I am focused, I did not feel the gun go off when I shot those 3 geese.
Mm.
And I shoot a fairly lightweight Benelli Montefeltro, which is not really a duck gun, but it's what I like to shoot. And I wasn't shooting super heavy loads, but loads I should have felt going off in the gun. But you're focused on the target. You don't feel it at all. in that excitement of the moment. But then when I make a bad shot, that's when I usually feel the kick, because I'm just not fully engaged in the shot. So there's even a sort of a mental part of it, I guess, in addition to the ergonomic part of it in terms of felt recoil.
The next subject that you kind of get into is air resistance and velocity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this section of the column is one that I found most interesting, because one thing that I do know is that there's a lot of duck hunters out there who really don't pay attention to their ammo as much as they should. And I think that you really outline in detail how these higher velocity loads or lower velocity loads changes basically everything that you do. And that's why it's easy, I guess, that we can drift off into, felt recoil. We can start talking because it all starts here. Kind of explain how you get into the details of this air resistance and velocity.
One of the things I did not talk about that I think I need to visit in a future column, kind of a misconception I think that underlies a lot of people's beliefs or understanding of shotgunning is, we're all taught that a choke works like tightening down the nozzle on a hose, which is true. It more or less does. But with that analogy in your mind, people think that shot comes streaming out of the barrel of a gun, and it doesn't. In fact, the opposite happens. If you think about it, it's accelerating from 0 to about 900 miles an hour, I think it is, in the first 20 inches of the barrel. And so it's the absolute opposite of streaming out of the barrel. In fact, if you think about, if you were in a car that went from 0 to 900 miles an hour, you'd be pushed way back into the seat. And that's what's happening to the shot as it goes down the barrel. It is, they call it setback forces. And with lead shot, it was a problem because that setback would, the pellets pushing against each other is what deformed pellets in the gun. With steel, which is so hard, that doesn't happen. But that's how it starts. It starts with this tremendous acceleration and the shot being pushed back. That's why when you find a wad out in the field, out in the water, it's got pellet dents in it because they've been pushed back. That acceleration is pushing them back into the plastic, and it's making those dents that you find. So it's coming out of the muzzle as a slug, and it runs into, literally, it's all contained in the shot cup. It's literally, and if you ever shot a pattern at like 5 yards, which I did once after I missed a turkey at that distance, I got a cardboard box out of my car and shot it. And, it's a hole, the diameter of 12 gauge. So it's coming out as a solid chunk of steel in the shot cup, and it's got a release. And what happens then is it hits the air resistance. There's that wall of air it hits as it exits the muzzle. And, that's where those petals on the shot cup peel back. When they encounter the air, so if you shot a shotgun in space where there was no resistance, it would just stay in the shot cup and go forever. If that air resistance is necessary to peel those pellets back, or if you look at a wad like the flight control that Federal uses or Winchester's diamond cut wad, those actually contain the shot for a short distance out of the muzzle, a few feet. And then they've got little fins on the back that pop open and act, there's enough drag there that those pull away, they slow down, and the shot keeps going. And then once that shot is released from the wad, that's when the air resistance starts to act on it. Although the pellets are all free now, they're still, the ones behind are actually drafting like a truck or like a bicycle racer behind or a racing car behind the ones in front. So they're getting a ride. Those are the ones that wind up in the middle of the pattern. And the ones on the outside that are actually doing the work of pushing through the air, those start to peel off, and those spread out to the outside of the pattern as it opens up.
I hear people talking about, Wadstripping chokes.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of explain that in the process? You just explained that process perfectly. But, what is the benefits or, I guess the benefits of having a Wadstripping choke?
The benefit of a Wadstripping choke is that separation needs to be clean between the wad and the shot. If it's not, if the wad is coming out and yawing, it can, it'll disrupt your pattern. It can run into the back of it. There's various things it can do to disrupt the flight of the pellets as they start out the muzzle. So that Wadstripping choke is slowing the wad enough to begin that separation before the shot is all the way out of the barrel. And the people who make those chokes are very clever at it and have figured out ways to actually change pattern spread through how and where they put those little studs that, in fact, I was just reading about that this morning. I was working on something else, and in the early days of steel, the story goes, people discovered they could put set screws in their barrels to get that. And this is one of those, don't try this at home.
Yeah.
But the original ones are kind of homemade, wad strippers. But every choke does, the more constriction you have, every choke is acting on the wad to some extent. But these chokes like the Pattern Master and the Wad Wizard have those studs that actually do slow the wad down and release the shot that way.
Yeah. And you kind of provide an example here as far as, the velocity and how that, changes as the distance gets greater. You mentioned steel number twos, using one at 1,500 feet per second load versus a 1,275 feet per second load. And how, that initial difference obviously is 225 feet per second. But at distance, that difference becomes smaller and smaller. Can you kind of explain that?
The faster you drive an object into resistance, the faster it slows down. Think about taking your hands, putting your hand in the water and slapping the water. The same medium, same hand, but your hand goes right in because the water's not pushing back. And when you slap it, it hurts because you're encountering that much more resistance. And, so the faster you drive a pellet, the faster it slows down. Now, that does not mean, I had a reader write to me once, he's very confused. He said, so at what point does the slower pellet pass the faster pellet? Like the tortoise and the hare, but it never does. Yeah. It will not. The faster pellet always gets there first. It's just that gap narrows it, and that the slower it's going, obviously, the less energy it has. So a slower pellet is in some ways more efficient, but it's retaining energy. The gap in energy also, it narrows as they forget the first part. But yeah, what I was trying to say is that the difference in energy becomes less and less too at longer range. So while any extra energy is good, the real difference with high velocity and slower loads is what you see at that medium distances. I notice that too, especially when I go to the gun club and I watch people shoot trap with a handicap load, which has got some extra velocity, and they're shooting birds a lot of those shooters are shooting their targets at 30, 35 yards. And the difference in how hard those loads are hitting a clay target as opposed to a standard trap load is pretty dramatic. Mm-hmm. And that's where the velocity really gives you an edge. If you're not killing your birds over decoys, more velocity will hit harder. It will also tend to open patterns more. All other things being equal, the harder that, again, and it's that air resistance acting on the pellets. It's as they push into it, they start to peel away. There's a terrific video I found a few years ago of a canister round from an M1 Abrams. The Army did a high speed video, and you can see this, and that's a couple hundred tungsten balls, but it's basically it's a giant shotgun. Mm-hmm. You watch this thing, you'll see it, and they track it all the way through its flight. It's really, really impressive video. But you see the whole the whole mass come out, and then you see the pellets in front will start to meet the resistance, and they peel off. And the ones behind are the ones that are retaining more velocity. And that's another thing. We talk about shot strings, and it took me a long time. This is not that big a revelation, but I didn't think about it for years. The difference in shot string, the pellets in the front, the pellets in the back. The pellets in the back are going slower. So the longer your shot string is, also the slower your pellets are at the back end of it, and therefore the less energy they will retain when they get to the target.
And you did some of that, didn't you? You did some like slow speed, or I guess I should say high
I don't know, they
speed
call it high
camera.
speed, but it's actually, super slow motion. I've been up to the federal plant a few times with their engineers, and we've set up high speed video, and we've looked at shot strings and patterns, and see a lot of interesting things.
Yeah.
And as far as we can tell, the shots, steel shot stringing is not really that big a problem. The shot strings tend to be about 8 feet long. And if you're worried about your shot strings, shoot a bigger shot, because those shot strings tend to be a little bit shorter.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The solution here is to go, instead of shooting a 2, bump up to a BB.
Yeah, I'm a shot person. To me, it seems like a more efficient way to increase energy, because you're not increasing velocity, you're not increasing recoil, you're not opening your pattern up. In fact, you're probably tightening it a little bit as you go to the bigger shot, because it retains its velocity better, it gets you the air better. To get back to that goose hunt, the last couple hunts of the season, I've been fooling around with bismuth all fall and doing pretty well, but I shot steel BBs on those last 2 hunts, and I had forgotten just how well those big pellets. And I don't know if people still complain about steel or if that's died out, but boy, there's no reason to. Everything hit the ground, and all 6 birds across those 2 days hit the ground dead. And so, yeah, my personal belief is that the big shot is the way to increase energy.
Yeah, and you shoot a little bit slower load too, don't you? Or do you go high velocity, big shot?
I've shot everything. I remember a few years ago, I went on an industry hunt to Saskatchewan, and Rio Ammunition was one of the sponsors, and all they had were 1 3/8 1,300 foot per second loads. And while I don't really believe in velocity, I've heard so much about it. I remember looking at those thinking, how are we going to kill anything with these? And we killed everything. Ducks, geese, cranes. I've shot the really fast stuff too, the hypersonics and those work too. But I think the improvements in steel shot, although we credit the velocity, there's so many other things that have gone on over the years in terms of better powders and wads and primers, that I don't think velocity is the whole story in why, how steel has improved over the years.
Yeah, and I'm sure, just like you mentioned, when Brister's book came out, that was the early days of steel. So even a lot of that stuff has probably changed everything. And a lot of that is just because technology, advancements in technology have changed everything from the wads to the manufacturing of that shot. You heard a lot of complaints early on in those early steel days. But things have changed dramatically. And I think one thing that has also changed is people's confidence in steel. And like you said, I think that's something to kind of mention. Everyone has their low, you like to shoot steel BBs, and while that higher velocity definitely downrange increases the impact, you're also confident with it. Kind of discuss that. We've talked about this mind game several times, but for me, I'm a big fan of ones.
Sure.
It's a little more versatile for me. It's really not, if you think about it, it's really not that much more versatile than a BB. But I really like shooting those 3-inch ones, but it's a mind game for me. I reach down and grab one and I'm like, oh man, oh yeah, one. Okay.
This has nothing to do with physics at all.
No, not at all.
This is purely confidence, and confidence makes good shooters. That's, if you believe, and also, it helps to have tested the load, obviously, and have the confidence in it and know what it does. But, absolutely, confidence in your ammunition is, one less thing you're thinking about when you should be focusing on the target. And, and that's absolutely true. Confidence makes good shooters.
One thing that you mentioned in this column, that never even really dawned on me, is elevation. When you have basically, or I should say even cold air versus warm air. But elevation definitely plays a factor in all of this. Kind of explain how that can play a role with a duck hunter. Let's say a guy's hunting in Colorado and then he decides he's going to fly into Louisiana. How does that change, what he's accustomed to shooting?
Well, there will be more air resistance in Louisiana because you're at sea level. In some cases, I guess you're below sea level in some of those.
Yeah.
But, and, air density that's what, we talked about already, that the pellets are encountering air resistance, and the denser the air, the more resistance. Now, this is counterintuitive. Dry air is actually denser than humid air. And this is also one of these things that run these rabbit holes you can go down where you think about it too much and it winds up paralyzing you. But a few years ago, I was at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, which is up, 6,000 feet. And I met Lloyd Woodhouse, the coach of the U.S. team. And he was talking to one of the shooters. He said, if you go to a trap shoot in Florida, said, if you're shooting a full choke up here in Colorado Springs, you go to shoot in Florida, you want to put in a modified. Did I say that? No, other way around. Shooting a modified here, you put a full in Florida because the patterns will be tighter in the thinner air and they will be more open in the heavier air down at sea level.
It's kind of a big deal these days, people traveling to hunt. And I know no one who even thinks about that. It's like
that would be a good thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, like you mentioned, you can go down this rabbit hole. Next thing you know, you're shifting shells and, changing chokes and, starting to really think about it. And that can definitely.
And that's one of the stories I always remember. Mike Jordan, who worked for Winchester Ammunition for years, he competed on the live pitching circuit where there's a lot of money riding on every shot. And, you have to buy your shells at the clubs usually when you go to these shoots. And he said he would always practice. He would take 7.5s and 8s and mix them up in his pouch. So he didn't know what he was shooting. He said, because I don't want to get to a shot, what if I get to a shoot and they don't have my favorite shot size? So he just didn't even want to be bothered by it.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So yes, you can way overthink this stuff. And although choke matters at the margins. What really matters, most birds are missed by feet, not inches.
Yeah.
If you're filling your mind with doubts like that. On the other hand, if it makes you confident to change your choke when you go to Louisiana or up to Colorado, then great. That's good. But I think for a lot of us, it's best to just find a load and a choke we like and stick with it.
Yeah, no, that is the key right there. The last thing on here, before I let you go is, kinetic energy. Obviously back to the physics side of things, kind of explain how important this kinetic energy is considering everything that we've discussed.
Right. Well, yeah, and that's the whole purpose of the pellets is to hit birds and impart energy to them. I tend to believe that it's not so much the total amount of energy they're hit with as where they're hit and how deeply the pellets are able to penetrate to vital areas and break bones and that type of thing. And you'll find, those are minimum kinetic energies for different species listed in different places. And those are pretty good guidelines to go by, but, you need to, people, sometimes talk about pattern failing before penetration or penetration failing before pattern. You need both. You need a pellet that's going to hit hard enough to get through feathers and bone and vitals and everything else and kill the bird cleanly. And you need enough of them so that you've got enough chances to make vital hits. So it's kind of a balance between the density and the energy. Yeah.
And I think one thing that you point out in here in the article is that, if two pellets, have equal kinetic energy, a smaller pellet will actually penetrate more deeply. And that's, that's all just a matter of, then you can get into some we can go down a pretty serious rabbit hole talking, shot sizes and, and especially when you start mixing it up. So let's say we go into bismuth or, tungsten, that now we're talking about some much different, equations, I guess I should say, as far as, the actual penetration. And that's one thing that, maybe we do another podcast and we can talk more deeply about that. Cause you see these guys shooting these tungsten 9s.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you've kind of dabbled with some of that as far as like a turkey load.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, we talk about different pellet sizes. There are still people who believe that smaller shot, it's the difference between being jabbed with a pencil and jabbed with a needle. And that is not the case unless you're changing the density. That, the bigger shot is going to hit harder and penetrate deeper if we're talking steel, and apples to apples like that. But yeah, once you look at increasing the density of the pellet, then smaller shot is going to, I guess it's more efficient, but it's got a smaller cross section that will penetrate more deeply. I've not done a lot of hunting with TSS. I shot a few pheasants with it, and I was amazed at you can't even see the holes if you shoot a bird with nines. I certainly, if I was going to have a bird mounted, I might want to spend extra money on 9-shot and TSS 9s because the holes they're not even there. They went all the way through the bird at fairly close range, and I thought I hit it really hard, and I had, but you couldn't tell when I took the feathers off of it. But yes, once you one of the advantages of the denser shots and density is very important. And that's, steel will never be anything was about 7.8 grams per cubic centimeter. And that's it's the burden that it bears. And that's why people want to pay more for bismuth shot, which is sort of halfway between steel and lead in density, or tungsten, which is in some cases denser than lead. When I think about shot size, I think of bismuth as being like to my mind, a bismuth 3 equals a steel 2 equals a lead 4. And there's people that argue with me about that, but that's kind of what I've seen and how I think of it. And that seems to work for me.
No, that's a good breakdown right there. And, what do you tell to people who just like randomly, would ask you or send you an email like, hey, what's the duck load that I should shoot? And a lot of times there's so many different variables here that I'm sure that's a difficult question to answer. But, I've even had people ask me like, hey, what should I shoot? As far as a duck load. And
for me, for all around duck hunting, and I say where I duck hunt, it's not infrequent that I'll have geese too. Steel 2s, 1.25 ounce steel 2s at about 1,450 feet per second. I shoot those, so this year I've been shooting Kent fast steel, which is a little bit faster, when I was goose hunting and previous year's duck seasons, or the Winchester. It's funny. They used to call it high velocity when it first came out because it was 1,450 feet per second, was incredibly fast back then. Now it's just like regular speed. I've shot a lot of those. It's just regular dry locks. That works for me. But again, I am never taking long shots, unless I absolutely have to, unless it's to stop a cripple or something like that. But, and I've shot a lot of, I like the heavy metal, which is one of those loads that doesn't look very good on the pattern board, but really seems to work in the field. So that's for me, 2s or 3s in steel for an all around load, I'd say. And mid velocity, I guess. I'm not a velocity. And you have to then again, make sure it patterns, because as we were discussing, one of the complications when you start to increase velocity for that extra energy is that it may not be an easy load to pattern well.
Yeah.
When you're done, it may be opening up, or maybe opening up is what you want. It's a lot of people are, I think, over choked for, if you do waterfowling right, you're shooting birds at 25 yards. I think, or at least that's about all the shots I want to take anymore. It's not that I just rather not. It's to me, it's more fun. And that's kind of why I go. And I know I'll still shoot some birds. I probably have to let some go, but I won't lose any. And I get the fun of watching them come in close. So for that purpose, the steel loads, the steel 2s that I shoot are great.
Wow, that's perfect. And I think, I think we probably took a little more time on this than what I originally planned. But I think having, people get a little bit better understanding of all of these, everything from velocity to penetration, and even how the shot cups and wads actually work when they pull the trigger. That's something that, we've stressed on here. Waterfowlers need to probably pay a little more attention to, how all this works to have a better understanding, and it'll make them a better shooter, which is basically what you do for DU Magazine, is explaining some of these different factors to help people improve what they're doing, in the field or even at at the range. But Phil, man, this has been great. This is a great in-depth conversation. I'm sure we can spin off of this in some way, shape, or form and probably get, 10 more different podcasts getting very specific. And it definitely, like you mentioned, you can definitely go down the rabbit hole the more you start thinking about it.
Yes, you can. But that's my job. Is I worry about all this stuff so readers don't have to. You want to go out there with a clear, confident mind.
That's awesome. Well, I appreciate it. And I just want to remind all of our listeners that, if you have any questions for Phil, or any questions about, what we discussed today, you can always email the show, dupodcast@ducks.org. That's our email address, and we can forward some of that stuff over to Phil and have him, maybe answer a question or two. If somebody has a really, really interesting question, maybe we can approach it even with a follow-up podcast. So I just want to remind our listeners of that. But Phil, this has been great. I appreciate you joining me, and we'll definitely have you back on as soon as possible.
I'll look forward to that. Thank you.
I'd like to thank my guest, Phil Bourjaily, Ducks Unlimited Magazine shotgunning columnist, for joining us today and bringing real physics to the discussion. I'd like to thank our producer, Clay Baird, for getting the show out to you guys and doing a great job. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the DU podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.